Okay, so some more on the Cartesian stuff that we were just looking at. Um, yeah, so Heidegger says that the everyday world is vague, but it's still a fact, whereas Descartes says we should only be dealing with this declare and distinct things. But what is declare and distinct? Like so, in the Middle Ages, they have this other example, which, so far as I can see, is just really the same thing as the Meno example, but it's in a way a little simpler, which is they usually give the example of the proof that all the angles of a triangle add up to the same as two right triangles, which can be readily demonstrated in the same style as the sort of um, more convoluted, as it were, the verbalize example given in Meno with the squares. Um, so this is this claim that if there's something else other than memorizing, and that it's a certain kind of knowledge which is immediately recognized, like a memory from. But the reason why it's posited in this sense by Socrates as a memory before the soul was born is specifically that it's characterized as being necessary, totally necessary, rather than a contingent fact out of sort of this Heraclitean flow of all the accidents, which Parmenides proposes to understand as the illusion, whereas being is the opposite of the illusion, the real stuff. Um, the mathematical facts, in this sense, are regarded as necessary. They're not in the stream of time where everything happens as it happens and is just a mess of misery where you can never build anything up from it, and you're always stuck in the misery, and the best you can do is, let's say, be hopeful, whereas the position of optimism is regarded as sort of a sacrilege, which is to say the position where you believe that there is a sure way to build up, which is the Cartesian position. Curiously, Leibniz says if the world is such a thing that even the puny human intellect can understand it, then probably it's not such a marvelous thing after all, which somehow rhymes and echoes with this difficult problem of what so-called romanticism is, this rejection of the bolting in of the clear and distinct building up of everything. Um, one fertile part of the discussion we had was this suggestion that the aletheia could be understood as negative truth rather than positivism. And somebody like Auguste Comte, positivism really means only that which can be observed. So it's kind of like the themes I've been trying to go over, which is that Descartes wants to say only stick with what can be observed, but then he thrusts this presupposition that it must be clear and distinct in order to build up. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, what would this juxtaposition of the negative truth as aletheia, as the unveiling, with the positive truth? It would seem to mean something along the lines of this. When we're straightforwardly dealing with our intuition of life, as it were, with the fullness of life, then what the Greeks, according to Heidegger, although Heidegger later repents and says it was misleading to interpret aletheia that way, and Gadamer, when asked about this, says that he doesn't really know why Heidegger drew back from that, and he can't explain it. This is in one of the interview books with Gadamer, but it's also, I can't remember now where Heidegger says that, but he definitely does say that it was misleading to understand aletheia that way in one of his texts. one interpretation of aletheia in that sense would be to say that since the Greeks from the beginning understand being as availability, then the aletheia, or or here what we're understanding as the negative truth, means that some things haven't yet been been disclosed to us, and we want them because they'll be we want them to be available to us. We want things to come for us, but it's tacit. We're not yet thinking of ourselves as the ego. We're just thinking of it being unveiled. Whereas the positive doctrine, which is the doctrine now currently in power everywhere, is really a doctrine of a specific sort of abstraction. So, like if you do, it turns out that the more that you can deal with the abstraction, the more powerful your science gets. So, like if you just try to do history, like human history, and you have to describe all kinds of human events, it's very difficult to say anything that you can just keep building up on, because it's just like this situation where somebody describes the events that happen in a cafe, and then the next night you go and everybody says something different, and there's different interpretations, and then it's like seeing a movie multiple times over the years, and you see different things in it, and it's almost like the object itself has been transformed according to you, and there's all kinds of vagueness and all kinds of weirdness comes in because that's the way the world is. But if you make an abstraction and you go to the pure abstraction, which is mathematical abstraction, where you just deal with consistency, like Stephen Wolfram says, you can have huge number of mathematical systems, but as long as they're consistent, then they're all logical, in the sense of not violating contradiction. Of course, I know they have these non-contradictory logics and the para-consistent logic and all this other stuff, but actually those are all can be understood perfectly well as consistent logics. But it could be regarded as a verbal change, those additions of the new logics, but which are developed partially in Brazil, I believe. We don't necessarily understand math as science today in the modern sense, but if you regard physics as the bottom line of science, this still could be understood as having several strong abstractions, such as that motion, measurement are the main things. Generally, it's not. We talk about observational science, which more accords to what Descartes is saying, but it's funny because Descartes' style of observation can also be discredited under the current regime as being a sort of psychological double talk, this talk of, what really counts as being clear and distinct. Then there's all these negotiations, and then what actually happens in practice is certain university departments, according to their needs, bring out a style of rigor, as it were, which counts as acceptable observation. You can go, if you look at the book by Arnold Brecht on political theory, you can see a lot of in-depth discussion about scientific method according to how it was understood in, let's say, 1940 or so. Today there's less talk about that, I think, because what happens just happens. So it's more like science is just whatever happens in the university departments, and they don't really care as much. Even though there might be more theorizing, it doesn't really matter that much, because the experimental sciences are a huge operation of millions of people involved, and they just churn things out. They don't really care to make the distinction doesn't de facto make that big a difference between an art and science and true knowledge. What matters more is that they're producing things, the output. I mentioned it's not exactly an aside, but it's part of what we were discussing before about this issue of what it means to be familiar with something, what it means for something to be simple rather than involving presuppositions. wait, let me say one thing first. We have this move from the Socratic example of remembrance to the Cartesian example of things like the triangles. That's taken as one meaning of the clear and distinctness, which we can build up from. Okay, but the other thing is this: once you get into a mathematical world, what counts as simplicity? So, as late there's been, this talk about, the physicists don't understand certain things themselves. So, but that has two sides. One is that certain effects are unintuitive from the common sense point of view, such as something happening here and happening, or I guess they did the experiment across the Danube where they proved that an event involving the an event involving the so-called quantum entanglement could be faster than light. This was proven experimentally. My own view is that probably has to do with this very simple fact that Einstein and Planck both proposed all their theories on the basis of what was observable, and what is observable is based on what else? On light. And the Planck number has to do with colors somehow. But the mathematician who died in 2019, I think, Sir David Attia, an Oxbridge guy, proposed the following. He said, or I suppose it's just an observation of his experience, which is that when he was younger, he observed that the mathematicians didn't much have an intuitive grasp of this operator called the imaginary numbers. And but after a couple of generations had passed, he was very old when he died, he noticed that this became normal. So you can see that somebody grows up with something, and their teachers who teach it to them had already grown up with them. This is going to contribute to a higher degree of intuitive knowledge, just like growing into a language is absolutely intuitive. In recent years, this thing called this spinor, S-P-I-N-O-R, which is a kind of ultimately a geometric operator, which allows the mathematicians to, in their systems of thought, to consistently deal with electrons. So it's like you have observations based on experimental data, and then you try to adjust your mathematics, your consistent systems, to work as well with them as you can. And so it's on the one side you have some imagination about it, where you're trying to get an intuitive grasp of what the data tells you, and then on the other side you try to create a consistent and lockbox tight, consistent mathematical reliable system to go with it. And so this question of this spinor has been around for a while, and what Sir David Attia suggested is that even though now physicists are all the time saying it's not intuitive, maybe in a couple of generations that will cease to be the case, because so far as this, the spinor isn't actually the phenomena, right? It's inside the mathematical system, which just tries to adjust to the phenomena. This is another question. Like we were going on before, just this simple notion that you have mathematical unit, that you can go from number 360 to 367 all of a sudden without actually counting things in the physical world. Mathematics is a different availability to us than does what we usually call the daily world. It's such, if you look at something like, it's interesting in the Middle Ages, in Descartes, I don't think in Descartes either, and I don't actually know when it came in, they didn't speak of the triangle as being 180 degrees. They hadn't fixed that 180 to it, it's totally arbitrary so far as I know. So like you could say, a circle is 367 degrees, whatever, but it would be less intuitive to work with, at least at the beginning, to just say something simple like, what is the if you have to divide 360 in half, that's easier than dividing 367 in half. Just something like that. Of course, you can memorize it, and so on. But there's a question of the intuitiveness of your mathematical system, and then of course people would prefer 360 to be the value than 367 for all the degrees of a circle, right? It's just easier. So you have things like that which come into mathematics, which are historical and which exist, as it were, outside math, which then challenge the notion of the clarity and distinctness of math. If you see what I mean, there's a. Okay, so let's stop there for just a second. I have limited memory on this infernal phone.